Nearly 20 Russian armored vehicles and tanks were torn apart in just a few seconds, and the entire column was left as a line of burned metal on a muddy road. The troops believed the heavy rain above them had blocked Ukrainian drones, yet no radar system, electronic warfare unit, or support vehicle could stop what happened next. More than 24 cheap FPV drones were launched from 3 directions, and the strike hit so precisely that it broke through what Moscow once called its steel shield, built around BMPT Terminator support vehicles. The attack exposed how fast the battlefield has changed, because even a well-protected formation that was preparing for a new offensive could not survive the first wave of incoming drones. This raises a difficult question for anyone following modern warfare. Traditional armored forces once dominated land battles, yet tanks and infantry carriers now face threats that move faster than their guns and cost less than their fuel. Drone swarms do not care about armor thickness, and they do not stop when electronic defenses start scanning the sky. This video will explain how FPV drones broke through Russian defenses and why systems like BMPT, radar arrays, and electronic warfare are no longer a guarantee of safety. The details may change how viewers think about the future of battlefield survival. The Russian convoy moved across the muddy road as rain covered the sky and reduced visibility, and the crews believed the storm had blinded Ukrainian drones. Nearly 20 armored vehicles pushed forward in a long column as they followed a narrow route through wet farmland, and the heavy tracks cut deep marks into the unstable soil. The crews expected a difficult night, yet they continued to move because the weather seemed to protect them from surveillance. Water on the road still slowed the vehicles, but the distance that observers could see gradually increased. Ukrainian drone teams were watching this change through radar feeds that showed how the storm cell was moving, and they marked every shift as the clouds opened across the sky. The Russian column advanced without noticing these changes because the crews inside the vehicles could not see how quickly the storm was clearing. 3 Ukrainian teams monitored separate screens that displayed the structure of the rain field, and they waited for the exact moment when the cloud cover would lift enough to support a launch. Their positions were spread across hidden areas on higher ground, and every operator prepared a set of FPV drones with engines kept cold until the sky reached the required visibility. The teams tracked the radar returns until the color bands began to break apart across the map, and the thinning pattern told them the drones would have line of sight within minutes. The operators then made the final checks because the gap in the weather would not last long. The Russian convoy continued along the road that curved through open terrain, and the column stretched into a tight formation because the mud forced the vehicles to slow down at the same points. The route offered no cover from above since the fields around the area were flat, and the broken buildings near the farm complex were still far ahead. As the sky cleared in short intervals, the shapes of the lead vehicles became visible from a distance, and the crews had no reason to believe the Ukrainian teams had already adjusted to the weather change. The vehicles kept their path because the march had to be completed before daylight. The Ukrainian operators launched 24 FPV drones at almost the same second as the final line of rain drifted away, and the small machines climbed quickly to enter the dry corridor that had just opened in the sky. Each of the 3 teams controlled a separate group, and every drone rose to a different height so the formation would not collide during the approach. The engines reached full power as soon as the drones cleared the first layer of moisture, and the attack wave pointed toward the Russian convoy while maintaining strict spacing to prevent interference. The drones accelerated and crossed the first kilometers with increasing stability as the air became clearer, and the Ukrainian operators kept adjusting their screens to keep the formation aligned. The Russian crews remained unaware of the threat because the remaining clouds still hid the upper sky, and the sound of engines could not reach the armored cabins over the noise of metal tracks. The FPV units moved at high speed toward the convoy as the operators guided them through the thin corridor of dry air, and the shape of the lead vehicles grew clearer with every second. The weather window began to close again as the storm advanced from the rear, yet the drones had already entered their attack route and were closing in on the column. The Ukrainian drones released their first control signals as they entered the clear air, and the Russian electronic warfare units detected the activity almost instantly because the SERV-SS5 array was designed for rapid signal capture. The system recognized the outgoing pattern and marked the approximate area of the operators before the drones gained full altitude. The radar network supporting the convoy activated once the electronic warfare system flagged the emissions. The Zoopark M1 radar analyzed how the signal reached each receiver in its grid, and the slight difference in timing helped the system calculate the origin point. This method allowed the radar to map the location of the Ukrainian bunker with high accuracy, and the data traveled through the Russian command line as artillery units adjusted their tubes. The Ukrainian operators could not see the radar working, yet they understood that every moment spent guiding the drones increased the danger around them. A Russian Orlan 30 drone circled above the area with its sensors scanning the ground for heat signatures, and the image feed showed a faint thermal bloom near a dugout that matched the radar estimate. The drone turned toward the spot and activated its laser designator, and the coded beam marked the area for an incoming guided shell. Artillery crews loaded a Krasnopol round and prepared to fire because the designator gave the shell a clear target during the last seconds of its descent. The Ukrainian operators noticed the sudden change in light around their bunker and recognized that they needed to start the handoff sequence. The first transfer required a brief pause so the drones could switch to the next controller. During this pause, they flew forward without direct input, and any delay risked losing part of the formation. The operators confirmed the handoff and moved out of the bunker with their equipment as the shell closed in from above. The explosion arrived moments later, and the blast lifted soil and debris into the air as the team escaped into the nearby terrain. The control screens in the second position brightened as the drones stabilized again, and the next phase of the approach began. The second team guided the drones toward the convoy while the radar searched for the new signal source. The Zoopark M1 repeated its timing process, and another firing solution formed as the artillery prepared a second strike. The crew initiated the next handoff while the sound of incoming fire grew louder, and the third position accepted control as the second team abandoned its post. The third team now controlled the entire swarm and pushed it through the remaining stretch of the clear sky. The FPV units held their speed and altitude as the crews made constant adjustments, and the storm clouds shifted above them while the road below drew nearer. The Russian column remained unaware of the incoming threat because the noise of the drone engines had not yet reached the armored cabins. The final seconds of this phase showed how narrow the margin had become. The drones advanced through the last part of the clear corridor, and the Russian artillery still searched for the position of the third team. The operators kept the formation steady and prepared for the strike as the swarm reached visual range of the armored vehicles. The Ukrainian swarm began to close the distance once the last handoff settled, and the 24 drones formed 3 separate groups that moved toward the Russian column from different angles. Each group kept a different height because the operators needed to prevent collisions while the drones flew through unstable air. One group held the lower layer at around 120 meters, while the second rose above it and the third climbed even higher. The staggered formation allowed the operators to guide the swarm without breaking the spacing that held the attack pattern together. The formation looked loose on the screens, yet every drone followed its designated line as the attack phase continued. The drones accelerated through the open corridor and held a speed of around 140 kilometers per hour as the operators adjusted their controls to keep the formation balanced. The operators worked through the interference because the timing between each group had to stay consistent, and any small delay could push the drones into each other. The screens began to show signs of static when the wind picked up across the drone corridor, and the gusts shook the cameras as the swarm crossed into colder air. The drones remained stable enough to continue the approach, yet the operators needed to correct their paths more often because the crosswinds pushed them away from their original lines. The fuel levels on the drones were also dropping because the climb through the earlier rain had consumed extra power, and the operators understood that one attack run was the only realistic choice left. The battery indicators reflected the strain created by the long flight, and each drone now carried just enough charge to reach the convoy and complete its strike. Small flashes of light appeared inside the cloud wall, and the sensors picked up the first signs of electromagnetic noise. The video feeds reacted with sharp distortions as the static built across the screens, and the operators needed to guide the drones through a narrow channel of stable air before the signals weakened further. The drones shook during each burst of interference, and the risk of losing control increased because the electrical charge in the clouds could interrupt the signal link without warning. The Ukrainian teams continued to guide the swarm while running across the terrain to stay ahead of the Russian artillery, and this created a difficult situation because the operators had to manage their equipment while navigating rough ground. The field around them was covered with debris from earlier strikes, and the smoke reduced visibility at ground level. The operators needed to stabilize the drones while moving between small patches of cover, because the Russian guns still attempted to track their positions. Each team worked with short bursts of movement followed by quick adjustments to keep the drones aligned, and this routine allowed them to maintain control even as the situation became more chaotic. The Russian column came into clear view as the drones crossed the final stretch of the approach, and the formation held its shape despite the instability created by the weather. The vehicles remained unaware of the incoming threat because the engines of the drones were still too far away to be heard. The operators held the swarm in a tight group as the target area grew larger on their screens, and the attack sequence entered its most critical moments as the three groups prepared to merge above the armored line. The next seconds would decide whether the swarm reached the convoy intact, because the attack run was about to begin. The Russian column finally detected the incoming drones when the swarm crossed the last open stretch, and the crews of 2 BMPT Terminators moved their turrets upward to build a protective layer of fire above the convoy. The vehicles activated their airburst system first because the crews needed to create a wall of fragments strong enough to break the formation before it reached striking range. The twin 30mm cannons fired in short bursts and filled the air with timed rounds that exploded at preset points, and the sky above the column turned into a field of bright flashes as the gunners tried to cover the most likely approach routes. The Terminators added a second line of defense when the grenade launchers began firing at a high rate because the crews needed volume to disrupt the drones before they passed the peak of the fire arc. The automatic launchers pushed a stream of grenades upward, and the air trembled as the explosives detonated in expanding rings above the vehicles. The gunners shifted their aim after every burst because the drones kept changing altitude, and the layers of explosions rose and fell as the crews attempted to keep the protective zone intact. The smoke from the detonations spread across the narrow field and formed a gray cloud that hid part of the sky from the Russian drivers. The fire control computers inside the Terminators scanned the air for clear signatures, but the number of targets made the process slower because the system was designed to track a smaller group. The sensors caught the closest drones first, then switched to others as the swarm appeared on multiple channels. The computers tried to match the signals to priority levels, and the list kept shifting as the drones closed the distance, and this constant change reduced the speed of the aiming system. The cannons reacted to the new positions, yet the quick changes in direction forced the turrets to move again before each burst could cover the right area. The limitation of the turret angle became more visible when the drones reached the midpoint of the approach, because the Terminators could not rotate fast enough to block all three directions at once. One vehicle tried to cover the right flank while the second watched the opposite side, and the gap between these arcs opened a clear path for the drones arriving from the center. The turrets tried to correct the angles once the operators saw the new movement, yet the drones had already slipped through the outer layer. The crews attempted to widen the fire pattern by switching between cannon bursts and grenade fire, but the drones continued to descend through the exposed spaces. And 3 drones broke apart when the fragments from the airburst rounds hit their frames, and 1 more fell after the grenade shockwave ruptured its battery. The rest of the swarm passed the defensive zone because the gaps between the fire patterns were too wide, and the smoke from the explosions reduced the accuracy of the tracking cameras. The Russian crews attempted to reposition their vehicles to create a larger defensive area, yet the sudden movement created more confusion because the spacing between the vehicles was already narrow. The drones continued to fall toward the convoy, and the approach became impossible to stop because the defensive shield had already lost its timing. The swarm crossed the last stretch of sky and reached the point where the Russian vehicles could no longer react, and the operators selected the weak spots that would cause the fastest collapse. As time passed, even more drones dropped toward the gaps between the turret and the hull, because this point created a narrow channel where blast pressure could jam the rotation system. The explosions inside that space forced the turrets to stop in place, and the Russian gunners lost their main line of fire as smoke poured from the damaged joints. More drones fell toward the engine covers because the thin plates on the rear deck could not survive the shaped charges. The blasts ripped through the panels and the engines stalled as flames spread across the compartment. The crews tried to escape the rising heat, yet the smoke filled the interior and the drivers struggled to push the hatches open in time. Another group targeted the cage armor that covered the upper surfaces because the operators knew the metal grid often created a false sense of safety. Some drones exploded outside the cage when the frame caught the blast, and the debris scattered across the hull without damaging the deeper structure. The explosions created holes across the roofs and shattered the internal electronics that kept the vehicles moving in formation. A similar pattern unfolded around the rear doors of the infantry carriers because the hinges and locking units lacked heavy protection. The drones that reached these points created blasts that forced the doors open and sent flames into the troop compartments. The sound of the secondary blasts echoed through the field as ammunition stored near the racks ignited and sent small flashes across the interior. The attack reached its peak when more than 20 explosions ignited in a span of 8 seconds, and the armored line turned into a chain of burning machines. The shockwaves rolled across the field and the vehicles rocked under the pressure as the frames lost strength. The convoy had no time to reorganize because every vehicle in the center of the line lost power and blocked the path for the units behind them. The remaining Russian vehicles attempted to escape by turning off the road, yet the ground was soaked from the morning rain and the tracks dropped into the mud as soon as the drivers tried to gain momentum. The engines strained under the weight, and the vehicles became stuck in the soft soil that stretched along the field. The last drones moved toward the immobilized machines, and the operators aimed at the exposed areas near the vents and side plates. The final blasts ended the attempt to regroup, and the last operable vehicles burned beside the rest of the convoy. The destruction of the Russian convoy in barely a minute shows how fast the balance of modern warfare is shifting, and the shock comes from how little protection heavy vehicles now have when a coordinated swarm enters the fight. Nearly 20 armored machines were reduced to wrecks after a short break in the weather allowed Ukrainian teams to launch a full strike. The result exposed every weakness inside the systems that were designed to guard the column. The BMPT Terminator failed to stop the attack, and the radar and electronic warfare units also fell behind the speed of the incoming drones. These moments reveal that small and inexpensive weapons now shape the field because they move quickly and exploit every weak point while older vehicles struggle to answer in time. The most advanced armor lost its value the moment the drones reached the turret rings, engine decks, and rear doors. The next stage remains uncertain because it depends on how fast both sides adapt to this new reality. Many may ask whether Russia can rebuild a defense that stops coordinated drone strikes, or if similar attacks will appear again as the war develops. If you want more clear updates on weapons, battles, and global politics like this video, share it and subscribe to Military Force.